Hello, and welcome back to the Dillon Church of God podcast. I'm your host, Philip Rouse. I know it's been a while since the last upload, and it's been quite a busy time as of late with everything going on at the church and everything we still got coming up. VBS is right around the corner, just a couple weeks away, and camp meeting will be right after that. So it's a busy time, and I'm looking forward to getting on into summer, and maybe things will slow down just a little bit for maybe a month or so. But I had a few people ask if part two was going to be the last part of the Jesus series that we were looking at as it related to Easter and the Holy Week. And I assured them that there was plans to make at least two more. And so I wanted to go ahead and try to get those done to conclude this short series on Jesus. And again, I know it's a few weeks past Holy Week and Easter now, but I think it's still worth focusing on the narrative of Jesus just a while longer. It is the main focus of the Christian faith, and I want to continue exploring this narrative of Jesus of Nazareth for these last couple of episodes as we ponder together the beauty and reality of the Gospels. And I want to start out with another famous story within the Gospel accounts, or at least three of them, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and thread in the theme of narrative that we have been talking about in relation to the person of Jesus of Nazareth. This story occurs near the end of Jesus' northern ministry in Galilee and is what I consider to be a sort of turning point in the overall gospel narratives. And this is the story of the Transfiguration. And I feel like it's a very pivotal moment because in many ways it represents what everyone is looking for, or what many are looking for, as verification of their own narratives about who Jesus is, or who he is supposed to be and what he is supposed to be doing here on earth. And yet Jesus, as usual, ends up turning everyone's narrative upside down again and revealing that the reality of the kingdom and his purpose and how it is so far removed from anyone's assumptions or desires. As usual, before we get into the story, I will set the scene as much has transpired leading up to this monumental event, and the disciples at this point are still having their troubles with their own narratives, as is seen with the confusion in Matthew 16 and Mark 8 of Jesus' warning about the doctrine of the Sadducees. It is right after this, however, that Jesus and the disciples make their way to Caesarea Philippi, and we get another famous moment from Peter. Jesus asks his disciples a question that is being obviously asked often and by many at this point. Who does everyone say that I am? Or putting it another way, relating to the theme, what is everyone's narrative of me? The disciples answer with the common consensus that Jesus may be John the Baptist, or maybe Elijah, or another prophet that has returned. And then Jesus asks his disciples directly, who do they say that he is? And this is when Peter answers famously in the Gospel of Matthew that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Peter appears to have the correct narrative here, and Jesus does not disagree with Peter's proclamation, but blesses him and directs him to the one that truly revealed this mystery, namely the Holy Spirit. He calls him Peter, meaning rock, which has become a point of establishment and debate within church history, to which I personally don't want to get too much into. Again, it is not Peter who is the central character here, but Jesus. In fact, this is not the first time Jesus calls Simon Peter, but it's actually shortly after they first meet. Many note that this change in name signifies a new identity that Jesus is bestowing upon Simon and calling him Peter. That Peter is not following his own narrative, but submitting to a greater narrative in Jesus. Jesus goes back and forth at times in what name he uses when conversing with Peter, which seems to signify in those moments whether Peter is trusting Jesus or falling into his own narrative or the narrative of others. What is interesting is how this interaction is portrayed in the other gospel accounts, which we hardly ever hear read from in relation to this event. In Mark and Luke's account, both much shorter, After Peter, through the revelation of the Spirit, announces the identity of Jesus, Jesus quickly commands his disciples to tell no one of this revelation. I believe this is because many have a different narrative of what it means to be Christ or the Messiah during this time that is contrary or even opposed to Jesus' purpose as the actual Christ. John's recount is even more curious, as it starts with Jesus asking his disciples if, after all that has happened and all that they have witnessed and done, if they, like many others, will choose to leave him now in light of the difficulties and sacrifices that come with following him and entering the kingdom. Peter, of course, speaks up in John 6:68, saying, "Where else will we go? For thou hast the words of eternal life, and we believe and are sure that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God." What's so curious is Jesus' response here, which is different from the other gospel accounts. Jesus replies in verse 70, "Have I not chosen you, the 12? Yet one of you is a devil." John then adds in parentheses that it is Judas who he is referring to. Jesus warns that not all who call Jesus Lord or Christ or Messiah have the same understanding of what those titles mean. For it seemed that Judas thought such titles fitting for Jesus, who he was also following at the time. Though Jesus does not name the devil, which I think is done on purpose, he warns all the disciples the same, once again not to stumble over their own narrative or any other narrative, but to trust the one who called them. Jesus follows this up by explaining to the disciples the true narrative of the Son of Man, that he must suffer and be rejected, and he will be put to death, but that he will be raised again in 3 days. This is in Matthew 16, Mark 8, and Luke 9. It is here I believe Jesus is once again putting the disciples to the test to see if they were listening to his warnings, and it would seem they were not. For once again Peter speaks up in boldness, yet not by revelation from the Spirit this time, but of a rebuke from the flesh. "Be it far from thee, Lord, this shall never happen to you." This time Jesus does not address him as either of the names we usually see, Peter or Simon, but with a third, much harsher title, Satan. I do believe Peter had good intentions in making this statement, but even the best intentions can be stumbling blocks. Jesus announces to his disciples and those others listening in Matthew 16, and this is verses 24 through 26. Jesus says, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul?" Even with the failure of Peter and the disciples to heed the wisdom of Jesus and the harsh rebukes Jesus gives in return, he ends with a note of hope, showing his patience and his grace with them, and he tells them of the kingdom that is promised, saying in verses 27 and 28, "For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done. Truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." And 6 days later after this, we find ourselves finally at the Mount of Transfiguration story. The actual mount that is ascended is never named in the Gospels, but there's been many theories given by church fathers and theologians and scholars alike, and we will mention one in particular that I myself find quite fascinating. But I will return to that later. This transfiguration story can be found in the 3 synoptic Gospels, but is excluded from the Gospel of John. This is interesting to me because Jesus' divinity is a large point of focus in the Gospel of John, versus, say, Mark, where it is alluded to, but often in a clandestine way, as we saw in the previous podcast. Eusebius of Caesarea, a 4th century bishop often called the father of church history, suggested that this very focus may be the reason for the exclusion of the Transfiguration story in John, as John had already alluded to Jesus' divinity early in his gospel and many times throughout. And again, John made it a point to avoid redundant stories presented in the other synoptic gospels. As for the synoptic gospel accounts, they are all very close in detail, with Luke being slightly more concise in wording than Mark and Matthew's account. I will read the account from Matthew, which is the one most are probably familiar with, but you can find the story in Mark 9, verses 2 through 13, and Luke 9, verses 28 through 36. And I will be starting in Matthew 17, verse 1, and it reads, After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah, talking with Jesus. And Peter said to Jesus, Lord, is it good for us to be here? If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. While he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, This is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. When the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground in terror. But Jesus came and touched them. Get up, he said. Don't be afraid. When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, Don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. The disciples asked him, Why then do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first? And Jesus replied, To be sure, Elijah comes and will restore all things, but I tell you, Elijah has already came, and they did not recognize him, but have done to him everything they wished. In the same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hand. Then the disciples speculated what he was talking about, assuming he meant John the Baptist. I've always wondered why the presence of Peter, James, and John with Jesus was noted in the Gospels more frequently than any of the other disciples, or any other individuals, really. I used to think Jesus had a sort of inner circle, not favorites necessarily, but those who he was preparing maybe for special roles or tasks, or had a special interest in. This may still be the case, but it is also an argument from silence. Often it is noted along with Peter, James, and John that the others are present, though it often does not name them. Also, Jesus does not seem to be one to have inner circles, as such exclusive groups are more of an earthly conception versus how Jesus typically presented the kingdom as inclusive in nature. This is not to say there are no specific roles or even hierarchies, but that such things within the kingdom are likely not formed from a perspective of importance, but upon relationship and identity. I think these 3 were likely closer to Jesus, if that was truly the case, simply due to their specific needs. Any good parent of multiple children knows, though they may joke about it, that they don't have a favorite child, yet how they relate to their children would surely differ based on multiple factors and needs. One child may stay by their side and be very close in proximity at all times, while another may be more independent, yet the love for both is the same. I think this was more likely the case with Jesus' relationship with his followers. Regardless of the reason, it was indeed Peter, James, and John who were called to ascend the mountain with Jesus in this story, and Luke's account adds that they went up there to pray. The transfiguration takes place almost immediately in the story, and while there were 4 individuals on the mount initially, now there are 6 with Elijah and Moses making a sudden appearance and conversing with Jesus. Now, I always wonder how the disciples recognized the 2 individuals. Did they just know, or did Jesus say their name, or did they announce themselves when appearing? It doesn't say here, but in typical fashion, Peter pipes up with an interesting idea in response to this divine and perplexing encounter. He asks if it would be fitting to build 3 tabernacles, one for Jesus, one for Elijah, and one for Moses. Mark and Luke add that he says this because they were all so terrified and really didn't know how to respond. And who could blame them? Here's the thing about Peter's suggestion, though, that I didn't really think about till I was preparing for this podcast. Why do you build a tabernacle in the first place, especially according to Scripture? To house something, right? Why did Moses build a tabernacle? To house the presence of God. You see, this is the Jesus that many have been anticipating, even his disciples. Jesus suddenly lighting up like a flash of lightning on top of a mountain, basically acting as a divine beacon and conversing with the great prophets and patriarchs of the people. This is what God is all about. These flashy displays of grandeur. This is what the people need to see. So why not build a tabernacle? You, Moses, and Elijah can just stick around for a while on top of this mount, resting in your abodes and all of your glory, while we go and get everyone else and bring them up here to see the reality of the kingdom. This is a danger to all followers of Christ. Actually, we can get so caught up sometimes in these narratives of glory and great displays of power that we can lose sight of the reality of the kingdom. Fortunately, this plan is overshadowed by a great cloud that appears, and from it a voice that announces, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." Interestingly enough, this is exactly what takes place at Jesus' baptism. All righteousness must be fulfilled, correct? The disciples fall to their faces in fear, yet Jesus approaches them in compassion and tells them to rise and be not afraid. And when the disciples arose and looked around, it was once again just them and Jesus on the mount. Now, there has been much speculation on this particular mount that Jesus and the disciples ascend, and in which mount in the area that it may be. Again, the text does not specifically name the mountain, but some scholars believe this is done on purpose, as who appears with Jesus on the mount during the transfiguration should be somewhat of a dead giveaway for anyone versed in Torah and the prophets. This was actually mentioned on our first podcast we did on fasting. There is a particular mountain in the Old Testament that is very special, which is the mountain of God, sometimes called Mount Sinai and other times Mount Horeb. This is a mountain that God descends upon multiple times in the Old Testament to commune with select individuals and groups. Two particular individuals are known for ascending this mountain to converse with God. Any guesses who those two might be? That's right, Moses and Elijah. For the Jews, Moses represents the law, and for Elijah, he's representing the prophets. Them appearing together with Jesus just further validates him, Jesus that is, as the fulfillment of such things as is noted within the Gospels. Surrounding this divine moment is another speculative theory that I recently heard about, but I'm not sure to its origins. But it suggests that this is kind of crazy, but a possible temporal displacement event occurred during the Transfiguration, collapsing three different events into one moment. That being when Moses ascended to talk with Yahweh in Exodus 24, and Elijah's ascension to talk with Yahweh in 1 Kings 19, collapse into this moment of Jesus' Transfiguration account in the Synoptic Gospels. They attempt to give support for this theory in that Jesus, as the Son of God and one with God, can certainly transcend time. If that occurred, the person that Moses and Elijah may have been speaking to without full revelation was the Son, or Jesus. It is also the case that the Son is often thought of as the physical embodiment of the Father that makes communion possible, as according to Scripture, no one can see the Father and live. We also see the familiar cloud appearing in the Gospels that also appears in the Old Testament accounts of interactions with God. Whether this modern theory holds any actual weight is unknown, but it is intriguing. Nevertheless, the clear literary parallelisms between these three events is noted and agreed upon by various church fathers, theologians, and scholars alike. After Jesus and the disciples come down from the mountain, Jesus charges his disciples again to tell no man of what transpired until the Son of Man be risen from the dead. And even after everything they have seen up till now, and what they just saw on the mountaintop, the disciples start to argue amongst themselves about the traditions of the scribes who were saying at the time that Elijah must come first before the Messiah, as predicted by Malachi in Malachi 4, verses 4 through 5. Again, even with the warnings of Jesus that's still tripping up on different narratives, Jesus answers that Elijah was to come first and restore all things, and has already come. Yet the people did not perceive him, and so too will it be for the Son of Man. Remember that it was Elijah that argued with the Lord on Mount Horeb that, Lord, they have killed thy prophets, they have demolished thy altars, and I alone am left, and they even seek my life now. The reality was, in fact, not the case with the prophet Elijah, as the Lord goes on to correct him, but this is seemingly the case for the Son of Man, who will be rejected, who will be alone, whose body or temple will be broken, and whose life the leaders and powers of this world will require. Yet the Son was not sent into the world to condemn it, but to give his life for the ransom of many. Matthew concludes uniquely that John, Peter, and James conclude that Jesus is speaking of John the Baptist in his reply. Their focus is still upon the narratives of tradition. This blinds them to the truth and reality of the kingdom that is continually taking place right before their eyes. And this becomes evident again right after when Jesus once again foretells of his death and resurrection to come. Yet the gospel accounts make it clear that none of the disciples understand what he is talking about, and even that the truth is hidden from them. Now, I want to juxtapose this story to another that happens near the end of Jesus' southern ministry before his triumphant entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. This is the story of Jesus' stay and interaction with Zacchaeus, the chief tax collector of Jericho. This is honestly a story I was not as familiar with as other stories from the gospel accounts. I knew, as most are familiar with, that Zacchaeus was the short fellow that climbed the tree to see Jesus, but I really could not recall much else from the story until reading back through the Gospel of Luke, which is the only gospel this narrative takes place. There are some really interesting elements as it relates to the narrative within the story, and it fits nicely within this theme we're going through. So let's take a look at what is going on when this interaction occurs. At this point in the story, Jesus has been preaching and performing signs and wonders all around the area of Galilee, and now is on his way to Jerusalem for his triumphal entry. But first he must pass through the city of Jericho. Now there is an interesting tension that runs through the Gospels as it relates to Jesus and how others react to his presence at different times. Sometimes we find Jesus being welcomed into homes and towns and communities, and many being excited about his presence, but at other times we find many who are unhospitable and even hostile towards him. In this case, the crowd and community of Jericho do appear to be welcoming to Jesus at first. It's a common theme of hospitality that when a celebrity is coming into your town or city, you make certain preparations in order to present yourself as welcoming to receive these individuals. You clear the highways of obstacles, make straight the way of the king, as John puts it, and you clean the city and offer celebrations and present the fatted calf, and you wear your best tunics and cloaks, and those of the highest status open their homes as places of comfort and rest for the individual and his company. It's a whole ordeal, and you can imagine someone like Trump maybe announcing that he is coming through Dillon, South Carolina for the weekend, and what sort of effect this might have upon a city and its occupants. They would revamp the whole city in preparation. You may see things get done in a few weeks that have been put on the back burner for years. Celebrations and events and crowds and many questions. Who will get to meet Trump? Should we present him with some sort of award or gift? Should we do a special interview with him? Certainly we must have great food, only the best for our president. We need plenty of press on this, cameras and lighting, all the works. We will need special escorts and security details, signs and special parking and welcoming committees. This is sort of the way you can imagine Jericho felt with Jesus coming into the city. But on the way into Jericho, Jesus has a few interactions, and the most notable of this is the blind beggar as presented in Mark 10 and Luke 18, or beggars as presented in Matthew 20. Now, you remember all that talk about clearing the roads and highways for the coming celebrity and their followers? Well, this is related to that issue. You can't just have the local drunks and beggars or the prostitutes or the sick and diseased out in the middle of the road or path getting in the way and causing a scene or distraction. That would just be unappealing. Imagine again Trump coming into town and all the local homeless and beggars coming in, crowding into the roads and sidewalks. That certainly wouldn't be allowed. Yet here Jesus comes, and the beggar or beggars cry out to Jesus, Lord, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. Son of David, that's an interesting title. Where did some blind beggars pick that verbiage up from? We've heard Messiah and Son of Man, but this title signifies a direct royal lineage of the line of David. I can just see the crowd's reaction to this. Someone failed their job here, man. Someone needs to take care of these guys. Quick, someone shut them up and escort them back to the hedges or to the outskirts of the town. This is embarrassing, but the blind beggar or beggars continue and even louder, and again I can imagine the reactions. Jesus, you don't need to bother with these two. They are a bit of a nuisance to all of us. Really, they are just going to take advantage of you. Let us take care of this, and you get back on the road and back to what you're supposed to be doing here, which is engaging with us, the people who really matter and are worth your time. Yet Jesus again has compassion, and he addresses the beggar or beggars and gets straight to the point in asking what it is they require. They reply that they desire their sight to be returned. And Jesus, in his nature of compassion, grants them exactly what they ask for and heals their blindness. This would be just as wild to see, again, with comparison to Trump stopping his escort for some beggar on the sidewalk and yelling for his attention and getting out of the vehicle and writing a check for X amount of money so that this beggar would be set for life as far as any financial needs. Surely this was thought to be an unwanted distraction, but look at the way Mr. Trump has handled this. This is the president we love and who we're here to see, and it was likewise with Jesus. Everybody loves a good miracle, even if it is for the local beggar, but if he can heal this man's blindness, imagine what he could do for the city, or those of us that are of high status and really matter. This was a nice little publicity moment, but let's get back to the real matter at hand, and that is what home Jesus is going to visit and rest in within the city. We would all be eager to know the same with Trump. Where is he planning to stop and make an appearance? And this is where the story takes an interesting turn. Going back to our little Trump visitation scenario, imagine that Trump has decided to stay and rest somewhere in the city of Dillon and desires to have a personal interview with the owner of the home. You would certainly think it would be someone worthwhile, someone of high status, someone looked up to in the community, maybe from a similar background or standing perhaps. A mayor, or a sheriff, or a well-known newscaster, or a successful business person, or maybe even a well-known pastor. Certainly only someone of such status and standing would be worthy of having the President of the United States as a guest in their home, right? But what if instead Mr. Trump decided to stay with the most unlikely individual in the city? Imagine the most disliked and looked down upon person you can think of. A racketeer, or a bureaucrat, or a cheat, or embezzler. And let's make it even more unlikely. Let's say that they are the biggest Democrat in the town. I would imagine such a decision would come as a major shock to everyone in the community and cause quite the commotion, yet this is exactly what ends up happening in this story of Jesus visiting Jericho. Let's read it from the actual gospel account, which appears in Luke chapter 19, and it reads, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through, and a man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy, and he wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was so short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter to one another, "He has gone to be the guest of a sinner?" But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost." So as Jesus is passing through Jericho, a rich chief publican, a tax collector, comes out to see who this Jesus is who is passing through his city. The tax collector's name is Zacchaeus, and though he is eager to lay eyes on this Jesus that he has likely heard about, there is just one major obstacle that stands in his way: his height. It's always interesting to me when the Bible decides to include details about a person's physical appearance or stature, because it's not always included in every interaction or description. And when it is concluded, it's usually for a reason or even several reasons. The most obvious reason is, of course, that because of his height disadvantage, he couldn't see Jesus over the crowd. This obstacle is quickly dealt with by Zacchaeus, however, as he climbs a nearby sycamore fig tree to get a bird's eye view. This is always a funny image to me. I can just imagine a short, stocky guy trying to quickly shimmy his way up a tree, and I can't joke too much myself, of course, because I'm on the shorter side height-wise as a guy, but he is able to make it up the tree just in time as Jesus is passing by, and Jesus does look up and see little old Zacchaeus staring at him up in the sycamore fig tree. And again, that imagery is it's just hilarious, and I don't mean to pick on him, as he often takes the blunt of many short jokes as it is, but I always imagine Ronnie Stone, who is our chaplain and senior pastor here at Dillon Church of God, up in a sycamore tree staring down at Jesus, who is surrounded by a large crowd of people who are also all looking up in the tree now as well, wondering why Jesus has stopped to stare at this strange little fella up in the sycamore fig tree. Jesus immediately acknowledges Zacchaeus and tells him to come down from the tree post haste, for he must stay as a guest at his home. Just like the made-up scenario Trump, the crowd is not pleased with Jesus' decision to stay with Zacchaeus. Does he not know this man is a sinner, a chief tax collector? Lord, why not this person who has prepared a fatted calf for you, or this one who has cleared the road for you, or this one who has done so much good for our community? Do you really want to stay at the home of this short tax collector / sinner? And this is where I interpret the mentioning of Zacchaeus' short stature to have a double meaning. Not only is it that he can't naturally get a good view of Jesus on his own standing, but everyone in the community looks down on this man, not only from his physicality, but from his status in society as well. Yet Jesus looks up at this man and chooses him amongst all the other people to stay with. Funny enough, the interaction between Jesus and Zacchaeus at his home is quite a short one. Immediately upon arrival, Zacchaeus begins to confess that he will give half of his goods to the poor and anyone who has accused him of corruption or thievery, and he will return to this 4 times what he took. This is a big promise, and one that I'm not sure the reader is supposed to take seriously or not. I really don't know if Jesus believed him or not, and we get no additional info about whether he delivered on this promise or not. Nevertheless, Jesus announces in response that salvation has come to this home and declares Zacchaeus as a son of Abraham. It's an interesting declaration. Though all who were of Jewish descent were by blood connected with their father Abraham, it was still custom during this time to cut individuals like Zacchaeus off from his own people in places of worship and denounce them as a foreigner because of their reputation and their deceitful deeds. Yet, Jesus notes again at the end of the response that the Son of Man is come to seek and to save that which is lost. Zacchaeus was one of these who were lost, and salvation was now here for him in the person of Jesus. Though Jesus is going into Jerusalem to be honored by all as a king, his true coronation narrative is one no one can grasp. We just celebrated Palm Sunday a few weeks ago, and it's one of those things that seem to come and go as quickly as everything else, but this entrance and all of Holy Week and the sacrifice and resurrection stories are something we should continuously meditate upon. Jesus enters the city as a king, and for a moment, like that of the Transfiguration, he plays the role that everyone desires for him to play at that time. Yet just as he expressed frustration upon coming off the mount, we see Jesus following his triumphal entry in tears, weeping over the great city. Everyone was looking for a king that would bring salvation by defeating their enemies, the Roman occupants and all the pagan nations surrounding. They wanted a king that would restore Jerusalem and its people to their rightful glory and rule. In looking for a king of war and power and prestige, they had missed the Prince of Peace. Jesus had come to take on the enemies that his people and the world had remained blind to, that being sin and death and the principalities and rulers and all forces of darkness. This will require a sacrifice greater than anyone could imagine, and Jesus would be the only one who could drink from this cup. In the story of Zacchaeus, Jesus had decided to take upon himself all the judgment and shame of an entire community in order to save the reputation of one man. On a small scale, Zacchaeus represented more than just himself and his own personal sins and failures. He represented all the people in Jericho, and on another, all of Israel, and on the larger of scales, all of humanity. While everyone saw Jesus on his way to what appeared to be a throne, Jesus knew he was on his way to the cross, where he would bear the sin and shame of many on himself and allow his enemies, both the ones the people were aware of and the ones they were blind to put him to death. As Paul writes in Romans 5:10, "For if while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life?" And many of us, like Zacchaeus, upon realizing and accepting our own salvation through Christ, may make such grand promises of change and of return, but who can really offer anything towards such a debt? Our best works are but filthy rags. What we must make up our minds about is this: will we choose to accept the narrative God has revealed through his word and through the word, his Son, Jesus, who is the true King, Lord, Savior, and Messiah, or will we remain blind to this reality and stumble upon our own narratives? Thank you again for tuning in to the Dillon Church of God podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's episode and the content. We will have one final upload to complete this series, and after we will take a short break over the summer in order to focus on transitioning into a new podcasting format that will involve some additional equipment and setup along with some additional planning. But in the meantime, do be sure to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel or on whatever audio streaming platform you listen through, and make sure to leave a comment if you have a question or suggestion for future content about the current content, or even if it's just a comment of praise. We'll take any of it. And remember, if you don't have a church home, we would love to have you join us here at Dillon Church of God and become a part of our church family. But we look forward to finishing up our series on the narrative of Jesus of Nazareth in the next podcast episode. But until then, God bless.